I don't know if any of you guys have seen the popular animated television series Family Guy, but there's an episode that I'd like to draw your attention to. The characters work out in one episode how to travel between worlds. And the first world that they travel to, well, it kind of just looks just like the future. It's really scientifically advanced, there's flying cars, AIDS has been cured, you don't even need to go to the toilet to poop. It turns out that this isn't actually the future. It's the same date and the same time. Well, why is this world so different? Why is it so much better than the world that we live in today? Well, the difference is, in this world, as one of the characters explains, Christianity never existed. You might think, what kind of a difference does that make? And I think probably your answer depends on what you think about Christianity. In Family Guy, one of the characters explains that this alternative world looks like the future because the Dark Ages never happened. Now, if you're not familiar with the idea of the Dark Ages, it's a popular view of this history of science. And it has a few central points. But the main idea is that Christianity and the Christian church repressed science for 1,000 years. That is, Christians squashed scientific progress from the fall of the Roman Empire right up until the Enlightenment. And part of how the church did this is by censoring non-Christian texts, burning and torturing heretics, and pretty much anyone who dared to go against Christian dogma. So the central message is that no science happened in the Middle Ages. Instead, the Middle Ages were a time of stagnation and suppression. So you can see why the alternative world that Family Guy offers is so attractive. Wouldn't we all love to live in a world that advanced and progressed for 1,000 years instead of sort of wallowing in stagnation? Wouldn't you like to live in a world without the Dark Ages? Flying cars are just the beginning of the possibilities. Now, we all know that comedy TV might not be where you want to get your history from. But the thing is, it's not just Family Guy that talks about the Dark Ages. Lots of us would know and love the great science communicator Carl Sagan. He's the author of the fantastic book Contact. And in another one of his books, Cosmos, he addresses the history of science. And he gives us a very clear timeline of the history of science. Can you see the really big gap in the middle of his timeline? Sagan describes this 1,000-year gap as a poignant lost opportunity for the human species. That's because, as we've mentioned, Carl Sagan thinks that the Dark Ages occurred during that time and that no scientific progress happened then. And of course, there are lots of others, including other popular science writers and the New Atheists, who really echo this story. And it is a compelling story. It's the story of rationality, open-mindedness, and truth at war with religious dogma. And it's the story of Dark Ages and Enlightenment. It's a story of an eternal conflict between light and darkness. And I don't think any of us want to be on the side of darkness. We all want to be defenders of light in this story. But before we really kind of sign up to this story and before we get on board, let's interrogate it a little bit. Let's see if it stands up to scrutiny. After all, isn't that what science is about? Let's be critical and let's test this theory against the facts to work out whether it's the best explanation. So we heard from Family Guy and Carl Sagan, but neither of those were actually professional scientists. Actually professional historians. Carl Sagan was a scientist. So what do historians think about the history of science? Now, it's probably unsurprising, as with any academic discipline, there's a huge variety of perspectives. But there has been a recent consensus that has been emerging among historians of science. And I think it's a consensus that might surprise you. The Cambridge historian Seb Falk writes, "The idea of the Dark Ages peaked in the 18th century, but as historians developed a new appreciation for the brilliance of medieval culture and learning, the term Dark Ages began a steady decline." I think this really summarises the emerging consensus among historians. The Dark Ages weren't really Dark Ages at all. Christianity and the Church didn't repress science for 1,000 years. The Dark Ages story is actually a popular myth. But it is a myth that continues to be popular, and it continues to be peddled even by people who are great communicators of science. And you might be wondering, how is it still so popular when it's been shown to be false? Well, the historian Michael Shank speculates that these great communicators of the science and these public intellectuals, they get the story from those who came before them, but they don't really submit it to a fact check. But tonight, let's do our fact-checking. We're going to take a quick tour through the Middle Ages to see what historians say about the emergence of science. And we're going to be unpacking what I've called the untold history of science. Of course, the real irony is that this history has actually been told. It's been told in hundreds of journal articles and academic books, but I don't think it's really been told enough to the general public. So we're going to look at three aspects of the emergence of science in the Middle Ages. We're going to look at the translation of Greek and Arabic works in Europe. We're going to explore the world of medieval universities, and we're going to meet some of the scholars who did early science. And I hope by the end of this talk that you'll be able to see just how much of a myth the Dark Ages are. But more than that, I hope you'll be able to see the way Christianity and science have built each other up and engaged positively throughout history. And I hope you'll be able to see the way that past Christians have modelled really good and powerful ways to engage with science. But before we get into these points, I'll just give you a notice on terminology. I'm going to be using science tonight in a much broader sense than it's normally used, because the scientific method didn't really kind of come together until the end of the Middle Ages. But there is generally a recognition among historians that even before the scientific method, there was a lot of study of the natural world, and that study could be quite systematic. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call this study science, because it did involve that close and systematic study of the natural world. But I really want to acknowledge that this is not science in its modern or technical sense. And I'll use it a little bit interchangeably with terms like philosophy and natural philosophy, because there was a bit of overlap in previous eras between those topics. But without further ado, let's get into it. So part of the Dark Ages story is that Christians have always been closed-minded and dogmatic. A.C. Grayling is a well-known British philosopher, and in his book on the history of philosophy, he gives a bit of weight to this story. He writes about the rise of Christianity. The Christians took the fallen stones of temples to build their churches and overwrote the manuscripts of the philosophers and poets with their scripture texts. It is hard to comprehend, still less to forgive, the immense loss of literature, philosophy, history, and general culture this represented. And this is just one of a whole litany of accusations that Grayling levels against ancient Christians. He talks about the writing over of priceless philosophical texts with the Bible, and vandalising and burning these great texts. Now, it's actually not clear whether the events that Grayling describes were widespread or even occurred at all. But there is one thing that critics of the medieval church get right, and that is there was a lot of science and scientific study going on elsewhere in the world, outside of Europe. A whole group of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars translated Greek scientific works into Arabic. They wrote their own works on philosophy and science, and together these books made up what we call the Greco-Arabic heritage. Now, how do you think Latin scholars, Christian scholars, might respond to this heritage? If you're going to buy into the Dark Ages story, you might be tempted to think that they would burn these books, they'd tear them up, and they destroy this great compilation of pagan and Islamic thought. But actually, that's not really what happened. In fact, scholars in the West heard of these books. And for these scholars, the thought of reading them, it wasn't disgusting to them. In fact, it was actually positively mouth-watering to them. They were so hungry for the knowledge in these works that as soon as they became available, Christian scholars began the epic task of translating them all into Latin. One such translator was Gerard of Cremona, who lived in the 12th century. And we know about him because one of his students wrote a little biography of him on one of his translations. And this biography is helpful because it tells us a bit about what Christian scholars thought of the Greek and Arabic books at this time. And the biography describes Gerard as he travels to Toledo in Spain in search for a book by the Alexandrian mathematician Ptolemy. When he arrived in Toledo, he was overwhelmed by the scale of learning that was unavailable to the Latin West at the time. His students record his reaction here, and they write, "There in Toledo, seeing the abundance of books in Arabic on every subject, and regretting the poverty of the Latins in these things, he learned the Arabic language in order to be able to translate." He regretted the poverty of the Latins. He got straight to work translating. By the end of his life, he had translated more than 70 books, including Ptolemy, Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and lots of other great writers. His students recorded that he wanted to show the Latin world as if to his own beloved heir whatever books he thought finest in many subjects as accurately and plainly as he could. I think that's a really beautiful picture. Gerard wanted to pass on to the Latin West his favourite Greek and Arabic books because he loved them. Of course, Gerard is just one example, but he is one of many European translators who felt really keenly how intellectually impoverished the West would be without its Greek and Arabic heritage. And this is also reflected in the response that European scholars had to newly translated works. Obviously, Aristotle was one of the thinkers that Gerard laboured to bring to the West, and Aristotle's works were received with incredible enthusiasm, even though he was a pagan thinker. One example of this is that medieval Christians simply referred to Aristotle as the philosopher. He wasn't just any philosopher, he was the philosopher. The Italian poet Dante had such a high regard for Aristotle that in his book about hell, Inferno, he couldn't bear to put Aristotle in hell, even though he was a pagan. So how does this compare with the image of dogmatic Christians vandalising the work of pagans and infidels? Well, I think you might be able to tell that it's a completely different story. These Christian translators, they weren't just open to pagan and Islamic learning. Many of them, like Gerard, devoted their whole lives to making it available to the Latin West. They had a deep passion for knowledge, wherever that knowledge came from. And I do think that they actually serve as a great model for how Christians can engage with scientific knowledge even today, but we'll explore that more later. So this passion for learning and knowledge is one thing, but so far the only science we've mentioned is the work of Greek and Islamic scholars. Were scholars in the Christian West more than just translators? Did they contribute uniquely to the growth of science? And this brings us to our second section on medieval universities. I don't think I need to convince any of you that universities are important for learning. Today, universities are the unchallenged centres for higher learning and science. Some of you will have studied at universities, others may have taught at universities. But what were they like back in the Middle Ages? Well, the author Richard Carrier, he has a few things to say about that. He says, in fact, universities at the time tended to be highly conservative and resistant to the new innovative methods and ideals of scientists that led to the scientific revolution. Christendom lost interest in scientific progress for 1,000 years. Those are pretty bold statements. But Richard Carrier is not alone in feeling this. There are lots of people who have the impression that medieval universities were more interested in burning heretics than studying the natural world. Medieval universities are often depicted in popular culture as restrictive and dogmatic, and pretty much mainly interested in just theology. And I think this view does actually fit very nicely into the Dark Ages narrative. It fits with this view that Christian scholars were anti-scientific, closed-minded, opposed to progress. But let's ask, is it actually true? Well, I want to tackle this story by pointing out three features of medieval universities. First, they were unique. Secondly, they studied the natural world. And thirdly, they were sponsored by the church. So schools of learning were popular in ancient times, famously in ancient Greece. But many historians agree that there was something quite unique about the universities that began to form in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. They weren't just schools where students could learn from a famous master. They were more like educational guilds. Guilds were beginning to pop up a lot around this time, formed by groups of tradesmen that were demanding legal rights. Latin scholars, they often travelled far and lived in cities where they had little or no legal standing, so it really seemed natural for them to form guilds like the tradesmen around them. So they were granted special status by the church, they were recognised by local political authorities, and higher education became institutionalised, and the university was born. So these universities were actually pretty unique. But what did they study? Was it all just theology? Were they, as Richard Carrier put it, conservative and resistant to innovation? You might be surprised to learn that science and the study of the natural world were actually a large part of what was covered in the curriculum of these universities. The historian Michael Shank estimates that about 30% of the curriculum was related to the study of the natural world. Fewer people in these universities actually studied theology because it was considered too sacred for just anyone to study. So most of the people who came through university actually studied maths, science, or philosophy. Instead of being restricted to Christian learning, study in these universities was mostly based off Greek and Arabic works. Over centuries, hundreds of thousands of students were taught Euclidean geometry, basic astronomy, and the cutting-edge biology of their day. Contrary to popular myth, scholars at Latin universities dissected human bodies to broaden their knowledge of human biology. They also taught that the Earth was spherical, and they had a deep passion for astronomy in general. They designed instruments to measure the movements of the heavenly bodies, such as the astrolabe and the albion depicted here. Instruments like these were immensely sensitive and complicated, and they really exhibited the skill of these scholars when it came to both astronomy and engineering. And there wasn't just study at these universities, but also discovery. For example, Nicola Resmi argued that the Earth was rotating, and his contemporary Jean Buridan broke new ground in the impetus theory of motion. As early as the 1300s, the monk Dietrich von Freiberg solved the problem of primary and secondary rainbows with an experiment. And that's just a little taste of the intellectual progress that was washing over Europe's universities from the 1200s onwards. So it is looking like medieval universities were unique, and they're actually pretty good. There was innovation occurring, they were studying the natural world, they were learning from secular sources. But can we give any credit to Christians for this? Well, it seems like we can give at least a little bit of credit to the church. We already saw that they granted special status to universities, as they did with guilds of tradesmen. But beyond that, the church actually provided a huge amount of financial and social support for universities. And it's for this reason that the historian John Halbrand estimates that the Roman Catholic Church is the greatest single benefactor of science in history. The anthropologist Joseph Henrich has a different way of thinking about this. He credits the church with creating the social environment that birthed universities in the first place. He highlights how the church strictly enforced monogamous marriage to non-relatives. And previously, Europe's social structures had been primarily kinship-based. That is, they were based around who was married to who was related to who. You worked out who you could trust, not based on anything except pretty much how you were related to them, and you identified a lot with your kin. The new marriage and family program that the church had slowly decimated these old kinship structures, and they forced people in Christian Europe to travel away from their family or city in order to seek a spouse. Without strong kinship ties to keep society held together, there were new structures that began to emerge, new connections began to be formed, and European citizens started to identify themselves not according to their family or their kin, but according to their profession. And according to Heinrich, this is why guilds of tradesmen emerged in the Middle Ages. And as we saw, it was these guilds which inspired scholars to form their own educational guilds, that is, universities. The historian Edward Grant also points to Christianity's unique conviction that the church and the state should remain separate, which was rooted in Jesus' teaching to pay taxes to Caesar. Grant sees this separation of church and state as the reason why universities could gain special status from religious and political authorities. And there are also theological reasons why Christian Europe provided fertile ground for universities, but we'll address those next. So we've seen that universities in Latin Europe, they were pretty unique. They supported innovation, science, and general progress in human understanding. And we've seen that not only did the church provide direct support to universities, it also had a hand in shaping the social environment that created universities. So what does this tell us about the Dark Ages story? What does it tell us about the story that these universities were restrictive and conservative? As Michael Shank puts it, if the medieval church had intended to discourage or suppress science, it certainly made a colossal mistake in tolerating, to say nothing of supporting, the university. So what's up with all those stories you hear from science popularisers about censorship? Where's all the heretic burning and scientist martyring coming from? Obviously, you've probably heard of Galileo, but he's by no means the only example of a Dark Age martyr. Well, certainly there were actually some pretty bad moments for the church. Heretic burning was real, and we can actually look back at that terrible reality as Christians and learn from it. But I do want to take issue with the idea that most of these scholars were persecuted for their scientific views. I think that in most cases that was untrue. I'd encourage you to look into any prominent cases like the trial of Galileo. I think you'll notice a few things, mainly that these events were actually much more ego and church politics clashes than they were a war between science and religion. And they were actually more related to scientists' views on astrology rather than astronomy. So when it comes to universities, though, there's the accusation of censorship and restriction. Strangely enough, despite how much medieval scholars revered him, Aristotle was even censored a few times. And actually, though, historians don't think that this had much of an impact on the intellectual freedom of the university. And that's because, apart from the fact that lots of scholars simply ignored the bans, they were only enacted by local groups. Any scholar displeased with the censorship in one university could simply move to another university. And here I have an advertisement from the University of Toulouse when Aristotle was banned in Paris, and it reads, "Those who wish to scrutinise the bosom of nature to the innermost can hear the books of Aristotle that were forbidden at Paris." Toulouse wanted to attract good scholars from Paris, and it took the censorship of Aristotle as a great chance to do just that. You can see how it would have been in the interest of universities and local authorities not to attempt any censorship if they wanted to keep hold of their best scholars. So now we've looked at the translators, we've looked at the universities, it's time to actually meet the medieval scholars. How did medieval scholars think of science? What motivated them to study the natural world? Were they Christians? And more importantly, did Christianity or a Christian worldview actually shape any of their science? There are some common answers to these questions, which are well summarised in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. For example, in his section on Newton, he writes, "Newton did indeed claim to be religious. So did almost everybody, until significantly, I think, the 19th century, when there was less social and judicial pressure than in earlier centuries to profess religion." This is a pretty popular view of medieval science. These scientists claim to be Christians because otherwise they get in trouble. Being a scientist is not associated with religion in the minds of people like Richard Dawkins, so he makes the assumption that these scientists either secretly didn't believe or just really didn't care. But more than that, Dawkins definitely excludes the possibility that whether they were Christian or not, their science was distinctly shaped by a Christian worldview or Christian convictions. So to put it really simply, any science that happened in the Middle Ages had nothing to do with Christianity. Tertullian, an early Christian theologian from Carthage, is famous for saying, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Athens represented the heights of Greek learning, in other words, early science and philosophy. And Jerusalem is the birthplace of Christianity, and in Tertullian's mind, Jerusalem is associated with Christian theology. So Tertullian is really saying, what does Christianity have to do with science and philosophy? Well, nothing. You could say he sounds a bit like Richard Dawkins. People have seen this as an ambition from Christians that Christianity is either opposed to or completely separate from the development of science and philosophy. But, as the American science historian Edward Grant argues, Tertullian was far from representative. Other early theologians were much more important to how Christians viewed philosophy and science. For example, Clement of Alexandria and his student Origen pioneered a new way of reconciling Christianity with Greek learning. They rejected Tertullian's idea that Greek philosophy was irrelevant or even evil. Instead, they saw Greek philosophy as good or bad, depending on how it was used. It was a source of truth, and they believed that Christianity was the ultimate truth. So they had faith that if they were used correctly, philosophy and science would lead to truths that accorded with a Christian worldview. These early Christian theologians and their disciples like to describe science and philosophy as a handmaiden to theology. Like a handmaiden, it wasn't the main deal, but it did have an important role, and it did provide an important service. St. Augustine, one of the most influential Christians and theologians in Christian history, also had this view. He encouraged the study of science and philosophy with a couple of caveats. And the works of these early Christians show that they really actually put this handmaiden theory to serious work. Basil of Caesarea was another massively influential theologian from around the same time as Augustine, and he wrote a commentary of Genesis which made extensive use of pagan science to describe the natural world. Basil's book is an astonishing summary of Greek learning about biology and astronomy. And Augustine himself followed a similar tack with his own commentaries on Genesis. They're brimming with descriptions of the natural world according to ancient science. And importantly, Augustine's commentary also included a stern warning not to reject scientific truths based on a particular reading of the Bible. And Augustine and Origen's commentaries on Genesis both took a figurative view of the first chapter of Genesis. Later Christian scholars showed a similar enthusiasm for theology's handmaiden, science. Scientists during the scientific revolution were excited to discover the wonders of the natural world because they understood those wonders within a Christian framework. Francis Bacon, a noted pioneer of the scientific method, talked about God's two books. One of the books is pretty easy to guess. That's right, it's the one that Christians are always talking about, the Bible. The other book was nature. Bacon and his colleagues believed that the natural world was made by God and it might reveal important insights about God or even important moral lessons. One result of this is that they are extremely motivated to study nature and science. But there were other even deeper implications of this view of nature, and these implications went on to affect even non-Christian scientists. Think about books. What kind of a characteristic do books have? Well, they have structure, they have order, and fundamentally they have meaning and rationality. They have beauty and elegance in how they're put together. What is it like to view nature in this way? How does this view of nature as God's book affect the people studying it? Well, it would be difficult to quantify what kind of a difference this would make and what would have happened if a different view prevailed, but I think we can detect a few subtle hints of the impact of this view of nature. This view of nature like a book, ordered, structured, and imbued with meaning and rationality. Some of these hints come from modern physics and, surprisingly, from scientists who weren't even Christian. Albert Einstein himself, certainly not a Christian, but you might say he was inheriting a certain view of nature from Francis Bacon's time, and that view of nature bore fruit in his famous theory of general relativity. I'm no expert on physics myself, but I'm led to understand that it's quite surprising how Einstein came up with general relativity. And what's really surprising about it is that he seemed to arrive at it simply by intuition. It wasn't based on past experimentation or strong experiential evidence. The chemist and philosopher Michael Polanyi describes Einstein's discovery in some detail, and he says that this was a slap in the face to those who had a strongly positivist view of science. That is, those who hold the view that science must be based off experimentation and experience. Polanyi writes, 20th century physics and Einstein's discovery of relativity demonstrate, on the contrary, the power of science to make contact with reality in nature by recognising what is rational in nature. Notice Polanyi's emphasis on the strangely rational nature of reality. This lines up with the view of nature as having been designed and ordered like a book. The physicist Eugene Wigner expressed a similar feeling. He was amazed, as many physicists are, by the astonishing power of mathematics to represent reality in an incredibly useful way. And he said, "We are in a position similar to that of a man who is provided with a bunch of keys, who, having to open several doors in succession, always hit on the right key on the first or second try." Like the person who always strikes upon the right key, seemingly by accident, Wigner is pretty suspicious. He's recognising that there's something rational in nature that scientists are building off. Let me provide another very controversial example. Many people take Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to be a blow to the notion of an orderly and rational universe. If it all just unfolds by chance, where's the rationality in that? In actual fact, there's reason to suspect that Darwin's view was indebted to the idea of a rational universe. And he wrote about his own theory, "I'm inclined to look at everything as resulting from design laws, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance." It's very interesting how Darwin references design laws. Again, we have a scientific breakthrough occurring with somebody recognising a deeper rationality at work within nature. In fact, lots of Darwin's contemporaries, including scientists and clergymen, didn't actually see evolution as a blow to the Christian view of nature. On the contrary, they saw in evolution a way that design and purpose could work themselves out according to natural processes, but under God's divine providence. This idea of the world working according to natural processes, but possessing a deep God-given rationality, can also be seen in Isaac Newton's work. Remember, we started out with Dawkins talking about Newton. Dawkins made the implication that Newton only claimed to be a believer for practical reasons. Well, was Dawkins right? Is Newton very religiously motivated? Well, Newton wasn't by any means an orthodox Christian. He did have some pretty unusual beliefs. But when it came to science, Newton was actually really obviously motivated by his religious views. He wrote extensively about his wonder at God's incredible creation. And here he writes, "All variety of created objects which represent order and life in the universe could only happen by the willful reasoning of its original creator, whom I call the Lord God." Here we have in Newton's writings the same idea again. There's a foundational reasoning or rationality that underlies nature. Our world is fundamentally ordered, and Newton believes this about nature for the very simple reason that it is a book that God wrote. It was made by God. So we can see that Dawkins didn't really get Newton right. The implication that any science that happened in the Middle Ages had nothing to do with Christianity, well, it's simply not true. The historian Edward Grant summarises it nicely. Latin Christianity provided a sympathetic environment for the sustenance and advance of natural philosophy and science. Medieval Christianity showed that it was prepared to do more than merely tolerate its existence. It actively promoted natural philosophy in an open and public way. The story of Christian scholars shows that there was often a direct connection between science and their faith. Science was shaped intentionally or not by a Christian worldview. So we've taken a fast tour through the history of Christianity and science. Along the way, we've had a look at what a lot of critics of Christianity have had to say about this history, and we've seen that their statements seem often unconvincing on a deeper examination. But I do want to note that this has been a very fast tour. I haven't had time to explore the nuances of some of the topics. So tonight we were myth-busting the idea of the Dark Ages, and because of this, I focused mainly on the positives of Christian history, but there were definitely negatives too. Even so, we've covered a lot. So what are we going to do with this history? What are we going to learn from it? Well, I think there are three ways that people frequently think about Christianity and science, and I think that the history we've looked at tonight has a bit of a takeaway for each of them. First up, there are the people that think that Christianity and science are locked in eternal conflict. People like A.C. Grayling, Richard Dawkins and Richard Carrier. And if you have that perspective, then I think the history we've seen tonight should actually challenge you to just give up that view. The Dark Ages are a myth. Science historians no longer accept that view of history. Christianity was often the benefactor of science, both financially, socially, and theologically. Simply put, Christians really weren't anti-science. Secondly, there are the people who think that Christianity and science don't conflict with each other, but that they're sort of in separate realms. There's no real crossover. Even some Christians who are deeply passionate about science hold this view. And for this perspective, I think history shows that you can be a little bit more bold about connecting science with your faith. Hundreds of years of Christian history testifies that science is really deeply satisfying when viewed through a Christian worldview. Follow the example of our forebears in looking at surprising areas of resonance. Think about Bacon and even Einstein and Darwin and Newton. Christianity and science weren't kept completely apart. Thirdly, I think there are the people who believe that Christianity and science don't contradict in principle, but that Christianity contradicts with secular and mainstream science. People from this view often espouse a literal view of Genesis 1 and believe that the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And I think that history can provide some context if you hold this view. Christians throughout history have been actually very open to pagan and Islamic learning. Remember Origen, Clement, Basil and Augustine. All these Christians believed that non-Christian science could be an aid to faith, a handmaiden to theology. They believed science and philosophy were ways to the truth, and if Christianity was the ultimate truth, then it would really stand up to interrogation. It would be able to be reconciled with the study of the natural world, whoever it is that's doing that study. So those are the three takeaways that I think we can draw from the history that we've looked at tonight. And I think they push us towards the position that Christianity and science are not in conflict, but can build each other up and learn from each other. And I think that this is a rich and rewarding understanding of Christianity, but also of science. And I think it's one that has borne fruit throughout history. I'd like to finish by saying one more thing about the Dark Ages. Most of the books I read on the Dark Ages said not only was it a myth, it was actually a surprisingly Christian myth. That's right, the image of light as knowledge and darkness as ignorance, and of an ancient battle for the truth, that's an image that harkens right back to the Bible. I began talking about how we all wanted to be defenders of light. Well, the Bible encourages us to be defenders of light, but not of some kind of oversimplified Enlightenment ideal. The Bible encourages us to be defenders of true light, of true reality and true knowledge. Christianity teaches that God has been doing battle with the powers of ignorance and darkness much longer than the new atheists. And he invites you to join that battle and be defenders of light and truth and knowledge, whether that be scientific or spiritual or theological. Thank you for coming.